A millionaire who had built his empire on discipline and control thought he had already mastered every secret life could hold. To him, loyalty was an illusion, and kindness a disguise for hidden motives. But one quiet evening, when he returned to his sprawling mansion expecting silence, he discovered something that shattered his beliefs. His new maid had brought along her young black daughter, and while he pretended to ignore them, what he witnessed left him frozen. It wasn't greed. It wasn't mischief. It was an act so pure, so uncalculated, that it cracked the walls of his guarded heart and forced him to question everything he thought he knew about trust, dignity, and love. Stay with me until the end, because this story will leave you questioning what truly defines us. And if you believe more people should hear stories like this, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to see it. The mansion stood like a fortress at the edge of the city, its glass walls and towering gates a symbol of wealth and success. Inside, every detail was designed to showcase discipline and control. Marble floors polished to perfection, priceless paintings aligned with mathematical precision, and a silence that made the house feel less like a home and more like a monument. The millionaire who owned it had built his fortune from relentless work and strict self-reliance. To him, trust was dangerous, compassion was weakness, and the world was divided into two kinds of people: those who took advantage, and those who let themselves be used. When his new maid arrived, he allowed her to bring her young daughter along. During long shifts, it was an unusual arrangement, one he agreed to reluctantly. The child was small, quiet, and often clutched a worn stuffed toy, her presence a stark contrast to the cold perfection of the estate. To the millionaire, they were employees, temporary figures in his meticulously ordered life, tolerated but never trusted. He believed that sooner or later people always revealed their flaws, their greed, or their hidden motives. That was why, one evening, he decided to test them. After dinner, instead of retreating to his study, he lingered in the grand living room, reclining on the velvet couch as though tired. He closed his eyes, feigning sleep, but kept his mind sharp and alert. In his world, the truth of a person's character always appeared when they thought no one was watching. He expected to catch the maid cutting corners, or the child sneaking where she didn't belong. But as the minutes passed and the silence of the mansion deepened, the test he had devised would take a turn he could never have predicted. What he was about to witness wouldn't confirm his suspicions. It would unravel them. The grand estate, normally so quiet it echoed with its own emptiness, seemed heavier that night. The millionaire lay still on the couch, his breathing slow, every sense tuned to the faintest sound. He heard the clinking of dishes in the kitchen, the muffled humming of the maid as she worked, and then soft, hesitant footsteps across the marble floor. The child. He prepared himself, certain she would reveal the carelessness he believed was inevitable. Perhaps she would touch the delicate porcelain vase on the table, sneak food from the kitchen, or even snoop through the expensive trinkets displayed across the room. That was what people did. That was what he had built his empire believing. Everyone wanted something. But the child did none of that. Instead, she carried a tattered blanket, faded from years of use. Walking into the kitchen, she carefully draped it over her mother's shoulders as the maid scrubbed dishes, her small face lit with quiet concern. Then, determined to help, she picked up a rag and began wiping the lower shelves, her tiny arms straining to reach. She was clumsy, but her intent was unmistakable, to lighten the burden of the woman who worked tirelessly for her. The millionaire felt something stir deep inside, something he had long buried. This wasn't selfishness. It wasn't greed. It was sacrifice, pure, instinctive, and uncoached. Yet his guarded mind fought to dismiss it, insisting it must be an act, some tactic taught by the maid to gain favor. But then, as the night deepened, his defenses began to falter. The child walked toward the couch where he lay pretending to sleep. For a moment, he braced himself, certain she would reach for his wallet carelessly left on the coffee table, or the jewelry box on the nearby shelf. Instead, she sat cross-legged on the rug, opened a torn, old book, and began to read aloud. Her voice was uneven, the words sometimes stumbled, but the sincerity in her tone cut through the vast silence of the room. She wasn't reading for herself. She was reading for him. She thought he was sleeping, and still she offered kindness. The sound echoed through the mansion, soft yet powerful. Each word carried an innocence that unsettled him. This was not a performance. It was something he could not buy, manipulate, or control. It was love in its most unguarded form, and just when he thought he could dismiss it, the child did something that shook him even more. She closed the book, folded her hands, and whispered a prayer. Not for toys, not for riches, not even for herself. She prayed for her mother, that she would find strength to continue working. And then softly she prayed for him, the master of the house, asking that he would never feel lonely in such a big place. The millionaire's chest tightened. For the first time in years, the armor he had built around his heart began to crack. He had been prepared for greed, betrayal, or laziness. Instead, he was confronted with something far more dangerous to his hardened beliefs: compassion from a child who had nothing to gain. The mansion had never felt so alive, yet so heavy. The millionaire lay frozen, his eyes still closed, but inside, a storm raged. For decades, he had trained himself to see the world as transactional, every gesture, every smile, every relationship measured by what it could return. But here, in the flickering glow of his grand chandeliers, a child with nothing to offer had given him everything he didn't know he was missing. Her small voice lingered in the air, a prayer echoing off marble walls built by ambition. It pierced him deeper than betrayal ever could. How could a little girl with no wealth, no power, no place in his world show more dignity and grace than anyone he had ever known? His chest ached with something unfamiliar, something dangerously close to vulnerability. At last, he could no longer pretend. His body trembled, and before he realized it, his eyes opened. The child gasped, startled, the rag still in her lap, her little hands frozen mid-fold. The maid rushed from the kitchen, her face pale, fearing her daughter had overstepped. The silence that followed was deafening, charged with the tension of unspoken fear. He sat up slowly, every movement deliberate, his gaze locked on the child. For the first time in years, his eyes softened. The empire he had built on suspicion and control seemed to crumble in that instant, replaced by something he could not name. This little girl had shattered the walls he thought were unbreakable, not with rebellion, not with defiance, but with kindness so raw it disarmed him completely. The maid began to apologize, her voice trembling, but he raised a hand to stop her. Words failed him, but his silence carried more weight than any reprimand. He wasn't angry, he wasn't disappointed, he was undone. That night, as the house fell quiet again, he remained seated on the velvet couch, staring into the dim light where the girl had prayed for him. For the first time in his life, he felt small, not because of failure, but because he realized how much love he had shut out. The walls of his empire could no longer protect him from the truth. A child had shown him more humanity in one evening than all his wealth had ever given. The following days inside the mansion felt different. The millionaire, once a man who measured worth only in dollars, began to notice things he had ignored his entire life: the sound of laughter, the warmth of shared meals, the quiet resilience of those who had served him silently for years. He watched the little girl with cautious awe, each small gesture from her teaching him something he had never learned in all his years of business: the value of humanity. He no longer barked orders with the same sharpness. Instead, he found himself listening, truly listening, to the maid and her daughter. For the first time, he began eating in the same kitchen where his staff gathered, letting go of the cold, formality that had once separated him from everyone else. It was uncomfortable at first, almost unbearable, but then it became liberating. The child who had once seemed so small and insignificant in his eyes had unknowingly rewritten his story. What had started as a moment of shock turned into the beginning of change. He sponsored her education, not as charity, but as recognition of her worth. He began donating to causes that supported children who had grown up forgotten, much like she almost had. And yet, the most profound transformation was not in his money, but in his heart. The millionaire, who had once believed he needed nothing from anyone, now understood that the truest wealth came from giving, from being vulnerable enough to let love break through his walls. In the end, his empire still stood tall, but he no longer felt the need to hide behind it. He had finally found something more enduring than wealth. He had found humanity. Because sometimes it takes the smallest voices to remind the world's loudest men of what truly matters. If this story moved you, don't just scroll away. Share it, like it, and tell us in the comments. Do you believe love and kindness can change even the coldest hearts?